Emily sat in her living room in Seattle on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The rain outside tapped against the windows, steady and soft, filling the silence of her house. She held her old acoustic guitar in her lap, fingers moving slowly across the strings. The sound wasn't perfect, her hands were a little out of practice, but the melody was enough to bring her comfort. Music had always been her companion, especially on days when the emptiness of the house weighed too heavily. She leaned back in the chair, eyes closed, letting the chords carry her back to a time when the house wasn't so quiet. When her brother used to visit, when family dinners filled the rooms with laughter. Now, life felt smaller. The people she had loved had scattered across the years and across the country. The guitar was one of the few things that still connected her to those memories. And she played it to feel less alone. Her fingers slowed, pressing against the strings as she tried to recall the full tune of an old song. The rhythm faltered, and she sighed, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. She had been sitting there for nearly an hour, playing in fragments, lost in thought. The afternoon light had dimmed into a grey haze, and the rain made the air cooler, almost lonely. Emily adjusted the guitar on her lap and leaned forward, trying again. The sound of the front door opening startled her. She froze, her hand slipping against the strings, producing a sharp, broken note. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Hardly anyone ever visited unannounced. Her heart quickened, but then a familiar voice filled the silence. "Aunt Emily?" The words carried warmth, but also surprise, as though he wasn't sure she would be there. Emily looked up, and for a moment she thought she was imagining it. Standing in the doorway was her nephew Daniel. The last time she had seen him, he was still in college. That was years ago. He had been a young man with boyish features, restless energy, and big dreams. Now he looked different, grown, steady, and confident in a way that unsettled her. His presence filled the doorway, as though he belonged there. Yet he also seemed out of place after so many years. "Daniel," Emily said, setting the guitar aside carefully. Her voice carried both surprise and hesitation. "I didn't know you were coming." He stepped inside, brushing droplets of rain from his jacket. "I was in the neighborhood," he said casually, though there was something in his tone that felt intentional. "I thought I'd stop by. I haven't been here in a long time." Emily stood, unsure of how to react. Her heart was still racing from the sudden interruption. She studied him for a moment, noticing how his features had sharpened, how his voice had deepened. There was a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just her nephew anymore. He was a man who had lived, worked, and carried his own stories. She gave a small smile. "Well, you certainly caught me off guard. I was just playing." She gestured toward the guitar, embarrassed for a reason she couldn't name. Daniel's eyes softened. "I remember that guitar. You used to play all the time when I was a kid. I used to sit on the stairs and listen." His words caught her off guard again, pulling at a memory she didn't know he carried. She had never noticed him sitting there, never realized he was listening all those years ago. For some reason, the thought of it touched her deeply. Emily motioned for him to sit, and he stepped further into the room, shaking the rain from his hair. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The silence of the house was broken, replaced by something alive, something stirring. She felt the weight of the moment, the way his sudden arrival had changed the rhythm of her day. She sat back down slowly, unsure of what to say next. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes moving over the familiar furniture, the framed photos, the books stacked neatly by the shelves. "It hasn't changed much," he said quietly. "No," Emily replied. "I've kept it the same. Maybe too much the same." He gave a small smile, then looked at her again, and she felt the intensity of his gaze. It wasn't the casual glance of a relative dropping by. It was deeper, curious, searching. She tried not to let it show that it unsettled her. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the spaces between their words. Emily felt her pulse slowing, but her chest was still tight. She hadn't planned for this afternoon to be interrupted, and yet now she felt oddly awake, as though the arrival of her nephew had pulled her out of the fog she often drifted in. Daniel leaned back on the couch, relaxed, but there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't entirely casual. "You don't mind me dropping in, do you?" he asked. Emily shook her head, though her throat felt dry. "Of course not," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It's good to see you." And it was true, but it was also strange. The years apart had created a distance that felt unfamiliar. He was family, but he wasn't the boy she had once known. He was someone new, someone who carried both the history of their bond and the weight of the years they had missed. She looked at the guitar, resting by her chair, the strings still vibrating faintly from where she had left them. The song she had been playing felt unfinished now, interrupted by something she hadn't expected. A thought pressed at the back of her mind. Sometimes interruptions aren't accidents. Sometimes they are the start of something you didn't know was waiting. Emily drew in a slow breath, trying to steady her thoughts, and smiled again at Daniel. "Tell me," she said gently, "what brought you back here today?" Daniel set his jacket over the arm of the couch and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Emily studied him for a moment, noticing how his presence seemed to settle into the room so easily. It had been years, yet here he was, comfortable, as if the time apart hadn't existed. Still, she couldn't ignore the quiet gap that had stretched between them all these years. She sat opposite him, hands resting in her lap, unsure of where to start. "It feels strange," she admitted softly. "You walk in after all this time, and it's like I don't know where to begin." Daniel gave her a small smile. "Then don't begin anywhere. Just talk." It was such a simple thing to say, but it disarmed her. She laughed lightly, easing into the moment. "All right then. How long have you been back in Seattle?" "A few weeks," he said. "Work brought me here. But honestly, it's more than that. I think I just wanted to come home. At least, to something that felt like home." His words landed heavily, and Emily felt them in her chest. The house wasn't just hers anymore in that moment. It was theirs, a place tied to family memories. She glanced at the photo frames on the wall, her brother's face smiling back at her from old pictures. Daniel must have felt it too, because his eyes softened when he looked at them. "Your dad loved this house," Emily said gently. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. I think that's why I came here today. To remember him. Being here feels like he's not so far away." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence, steady and calm. Emily felt the weight of her brother's absence more than ever. It was as though Daniel carried a piece of him in his expression, in the way he held himself. She reached for the guitar again, running her fingers along the strings absent-mindedly. "Your father used to sit here and ask me to play. He always wanted the same song. I could never get it quite right, but he didn't care. He just liked to listen." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "I remember that. I used to think the song belonged to this house. Any time I heard it, I thought of being here." Emily blinked, touched by his memory. She hadn't realized how closely he had paid attention as a boy. The thought warmed her, but it also made her chest ache. They had lost so much time. She leaned forward. "And you? What about your life? Tell me what I've missed." Daniel shifted, running a hand through his hair. "A lot, I suppose. I studied hard, worked hard, tried to make something of myself. But sometimes I wonder if I've been chasing things that don't matter as much as I thought they did." Emily tilted her head. "Like what?" He hesitated, then shrugged. Titles, positions, paychecks. They're fine, but they don't fill the quiet moments. I realized lately that I've been moving so fast, I forgot to hold on to the people who matter. Her throat tightened. The sincerity in his voice was raw, unpolished. He wasn't just making conversation. He was sharing something deeper. She felt honored that he trusted her with it, though it also stung, because she knew she was one of those people he had let slip away. "You're here now," Emily said softly. "That's what matters." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed smaller, more intimate. Emily quickly looked away, brushing her fingers across the guitar strings. Daniel leaned back, his gaze following her movements. "Do you still play often?" "Not as much as I used to," she admitted. "Some days I feel like I've lost the songs inside me. Maybe they're just waiting for someone to listen again." He said. The simplicity of his words disarmed her. He had always had a way of saying things that lingered. When he was younger, it had been careless and playful. Now, it was careful, deliberate, carrying the weight of thought. Emily tried to keep the conversation light. "And what about you? Any big plans now that you're back?" Daniel paused, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, I don't know. For once, I don't have it all mapped out. I think I just want to slow down. Spend time with the people I've missed. Maybe figure out what home really means." Her chest tightened again. It was such an honest thing to say, and it hit her harder than she expected. She realized how deeply she had missed him, how much she had missed the comfort of family. The conversation drifted, but it never felt forced. They spoke about the years apart, his studies, his travels, her work, her solitude. Daniel shared stories about friends who had come and gone, choices he had questioned, lessons he had learned. Emily listened closely, surprised at how much of him she hadn't known before. As the rain continued, the distance between them felt smaller. Emily noticed details she hadn't expected: the calmness in his voice, the way his laughter carried warmth, the quiet heaviness when he spoke of his father. Yet beneath it all was something unspoken, a tension neither of them addressed. Emily felt it in the way he looked at her, in the pauses between words. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was undeniable, a sense of closeness that was more than just family catching up. She shifted in her chair, trying to steady herself. "He's your nephew," she reminded herself. The thought was sharp, but it didn't erase the strange current in the room. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You know, I never told you this, but when I was younger, I always thought of you as more than just my aunt. You were the one who made the house feel alive, the one who made it safe." Emily's breath caught. The words were innocent, but they carried weight. She forced a smile, her voice quiet. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I did," he said simply. "I still do." The rain outside seemed to grow louder, as if pressing against the windows to remind them of the world beyond. Emily gripped the edge of the guitar, grounding herself. She didn't want to overthink his words, but they stayed with her, pulling at something deep inside. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passing of time, but neither of them seemed in a rush to move. Their conversations stretched late into the evening, and though the years of distance weren't erased, they were softened. By the time Daniel glanced at his phone, the sky outside was nearly dark. He looked back at her and gave a faint smile. "I didn't mean to stay this long." Emily shook her head. "I'm glad you did." And as he leaned back, comfortable and unhurried, Emily realized something had shifted. The distance between them wasn't gone, but it was no longer a wall. It was a bridge, fragile, delicate, but strong enough to hold the weight of two people trying to find their way back to each other. The rain grew heavier as evening settled over Seattle, the house filling with the sound of water hitting the windows and roof. Daniel moved easily through the kitchen, opening cabinets, checking the fridge, finding ingredients with the confidence of someone who remembered where everything belonged. Emily stood at the counter, watching him in silence. She hadn't asked him to cook, but he had insisted, saying she had done enough for him over the years. The smell of garlic and onions filled the room as he worked. His sleeves were rolled up, his movements steady, unhurried. Emily leaned against the wall, feeling a strange warmth build in her chest. It wasn't just the comfort of having someone in the house again. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Do you still like pasta?" Daniel asked, looking over his shoulder with a small grin. She nodded, her voice softer than she expected. "Always," he chuckled, stirring the pan. "Good. Some things never change." Emily smiled faintly, but her heart was beating faster than it should. She told herself it was simply because of the memories, family dinners, laughter, her brother sitting at the table while she played her guitar. Yet, as she watched Daniel move, as she listened to his voice, she felt an awareness that unsettled her. When the food was ready, they sat across from each other at the small dining table. The candlelight flickered softly between them, casting shadows across his face. He looked older than she remembered, yet still carried something of the boy she had known. He spoke about work, about the challenges he had faced, about the decisions he was trying to make now that he was back in Seattle. Emily listened closely, her chin resting in her hand. The way he spoke wasn't rushed or careless. It was thoughtful, deliberate, as though he trusted her with pieces of himself he didn't often share. She found herself leaning into the conversation, drawn in by the honesty in his voice. At one point, he paused, setting down his fork. "You know, I used to think you were the strongest person I knew. You were always the one keeping everything together, even when things were falling apart." His words caught her off guard. She blinked, unsure of how to respond. "That's a generous way of remembering," she said quietly. "It's the truth," Daniel replied. "I don't think I've ever told you how much you meant to me back then." "Even now?" Emily's chest tightened. She looked down at her plate, trying to steady herself. The words weren't romantic, but they carried weight. They stirred something inside her she didn't want to name. After dinner, they moved back to the living room. Daniel stretched out on the couch, relaxed, while Emily picked up the guitar again, almost without thinking. She strummed a few notes, the sound filling the air between them. Daniel watched her, his expression soft. "That song," he said. "You played it all the time when I was little." Emily nodded, her fingers trembling slightly on the strings. "I never knew you noticed." "I noticed everything," he said. His voice was quiet, but steady. The moment lingered, heavier than before. Emily felt the room shrink around them, the rain outside pressing closer. She couldn't ignore the tension anymore. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was undeniable, a closeness that had nothing to do with family obligation. It was something deeper, something born from years of silence and the sudden return of connection. She tried to push the thought away. "He's your nephew," she reminded herself again. But emotions don't always follow rules. They arrive uninvited, stirring feelings that don't fit into tidy boxes. Her hands faltered on the guitar, the melody breaking. She set it aside quickly, embarrassed. "I'm out of practice," she said, her voice too fast. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's still beautiful. You're still beautiful when you play." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had said before. Emily's breath caught, her pulse racing. She searched his face, trying to decide if he meant it the way it sounded. His expression gave nothing away except sincerity. She stood abruptly, needing space, moving toward the window. The rain streaked the glass, the city lights blurred beyond it. Her reflection stared back at her older, lined with years, yet alive in a way she hadn't felt in so long. Daniel rose slowly and joined her at the window. He didn't stand too close, but his presence was enough to make her heart race. "I don't want you to be alone anymore," he said softly. Emily swallowed hard. "Loneliness is a part of life. I've learned to live with it. You don't have to," he replied. His voice carried a quiet conviction, almost a promise. She turned toward him, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged. She saw the earnestness in his eyes, the longing he didn't bother to hide. She felt her own heart respond, aching with the weight of years spent in silence, in solitude, but she couldn't let it go further. She took a slow breath and stepped back, forcing a small smile. "It's getting late," she said gently. "You should probably head home." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right, but I'll come back. If you'll let me." Emily nodded, though her throat felt tight. "Of course." As he gathered his things, the silence between them felt different than before, thicker, full of words unsaid. He paused at the door, glancing back at her. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "It meant more than you know." When the door closed behind him, Emily stood still, her hand pressed against her chest. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence. Something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. She sat back down, picking up the guitar once more. Her fingers moved over the strings, but the song sounded different, now haunted, tender, filled with emotions she couldn't put into words. And as the rain poured down outside, she whispered to herself, "Something has begun. I don't know what, but it has." The next morning, Emily woke to the soft light of dawn spilling across her bedroom. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air clear and still. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, her mind restless. The night before kept replaying in her thoughts the way Daniel had looked at her, the way his words had carried weight she didn't expect. She rose slowly, moving through her house with the familiar rhythm of her routine coffee brewing, blinds opening, the quiet hum of the city beyond her windows. Yet nothing felt the same. Even the silence seemed alive now, as though it carried the echo of Daniel's laughter, his voice, his presence. As she sipped her coffee by the window, she tried to make sense of the feelings inside her. He was her nephew, yes, but the bond they shared was complicated. Years apart had made them strangers, and yet his return had pulled them closer than she thought possible. It wasn't romance she was chasing, it was connection, the kind she had been missing for too long. Later that afternoon, she heard the knock on her door. Her heart leapt before her mind caught up. She knew it was him. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there with a shy smile, holding a small bag of groceries. "I thought you might not have much in the fridge," he said lightly. Emily stepped aside, hiding her rush of relief. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he replied simply. The kitchen filled with the sound of him unpacking vegetables and bread, setting them neatly on the counter. Emily watched him again, that same strange warmth returning. She tried to keep her voice steady. "You don't need to take care of me, Daniel." He looked at her, his expression calm. "Maybe I need to." The words caught her off guard. She turned away, pretending to wipe the counter, her chest tightening. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of care. She had always been the one to give, to hold things together. Now, with him here, she felt the unfamiliar weight of being seen. They cooked together that evening. The simple act chopping vegetables, stirring a pot, moving around each other in the small kitchen felt oddly intimate. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same spoon, and the moment lingered longer than it should have. Neither spoke of it, but the silence that followed was heavy. After dinner, they sat again in the living room. The guitar rested nearby, as though waiting. Daniel leaned back, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever think about what you've missed? The things you didn't do because life just went another way? Emily hesitated. The question was too close, too sharp. All the time, she admitted quietly. He nodded slowly. Me too. Their eyes met, and Emily felt the weight of unspoken truths press between them. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The intensity of the moment made her heart race. She thought of all the years she had lived quietly, safely, without risk. And here was Daniel, sitting across from her, reminding her of everything she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Finally, she broke the silence. Daniel, we can't. I know, he said quickly, his voice firm. I know what you're going to say. I'm not asking for anything you can't give. I want to be here. I want you to know you don't have to be alone. The honesty in his words left her breathless. She wanted to argue, to remind him of the lines that couldn't be crossed. But instead she felt her eyes sting with tears. She hadn't realized until now how deeply she had needed to hear those words. Daniel reached forward, not touching her, but letting his hand rest on the arm of the chair near hers. The gesture was small, but it carried a world of meaning. He wasn't asking for anything more. He was simply offering his presence. Emily drew in a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. You remind me so much of your father, she whispered. The way you speak, the way you look at people like they matter. He had that same gift. Daniel smiled faintly, his eyes soft. Then maybe that's why I came back here, to find the part of him I lost. And maybe to remind you of the part of yourself you've forgotten. Her chest ached with emotion. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze any longer. She felt the sharp pull of longing, not for something forbidden, but for connection, for closeness, for life itself. The evening stretched on quietly. They talked of small things, avoiding the heaviness that hung in the air, but it was always there, unspoken. Finally, as the night grew late, Daniel stood. I should go, he said softly. Emily rose with him, following him to the door. The air between them was thick with things left unsaid. He paused, turning to her, his expression serious. Promise me something. Don't lock yourself away again. Let me come back. Let me sit with you, play music, cook dinner. Let me be here. Emily's throat tightened, but she managed to nod. I promise. He gave her a small smile, one that felt both tender and determined. Then he stepped out into the night, the cool air rushing in as the door closed behind him. Emily stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty, it was full, humming with the memory of his voice, his presence, his promise. She walked back to the living room and picked up her guitar. Her fingers moved across the strings, hesitant at first, then stronger. The melody came back to her, fuller than before. She realized she wasn't playing for herself anymore. She was playing for the connection that had returned to her life, for the bond that had been awakened. As the last note faded, she closed her eyes and let the sound linger. She didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know if it was right or wrong, safe or risky. All she knew was that something inside her had opened, and she wasn't ready to close it again. She whispered into the quiet room, her voice barely audible. This story isn't over. Not yet. And with that she set the guitar aside, a small smile touching her lips. The door had been left open, not just the one Daniel had walked through, but the one inside her heart.